Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Jason Lee Byas. Jason is a fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society and a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Michigan. His academic work focuses on punishment and its alternatives, rights theory, and justice beyond the state. He approaches that work from within the libertarian, liberal, and anarchist traditions, all of which are broadly construed. Today we discuss some recent work he's been doing on methodological anarchist approaches to political philosophy, as well as the nature of violence and its relationship to a theory of just property rights and distributive justice. The first part of this conversation focuses on a bias a lot of analytic political philosophers and political commentators generally have on focusing on the nature of justice as applying only to the state and state policy. Jason argues for a methodological anarchist approach that sees the nexus of justice as existing in social norms writ large rather than just official institutions. The second part goes into a libertarian theory of violence that, when combined with certain normative presumptions against violence, can accommodate and generate a new theory of property rights claims. We then try to work through the implications of this theory for intellectual property, absentee landownership, and the relationship of such rights claims to concerns about equity. This was a fun and interesting conversation where we covered a ton of novel philosophical ground, so I hope you enjoy it. So here's Jason Lee Byas. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'm Zachary Woodman, and joining me today is Jason Lee Byas. Hi, Jason.
Hello.
So we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation over a number of philosophical topics you've written on, including what is distinctive about anarchist political philosophy and how it provides a framework even for non-anarchists, stuff about violence and property rights chains. So let's start. You have a forthcoming paper on what you call methodological anarchism, which is broadly an approach to political philosophy. So in broadest terms, what do you mean by methodological anarchism, and how do you think it is an alternative framework both for political philosophers and everyday thinkers?
Yeah, so that's a chapter in an anthology on anarchism that I've co-authored with Billy Christmas, who's a political economy at King's College London. And basically the kind of outlook we're giving there is a framing of politics beyond policy, you might say.
Okay.
So the idea is that within...
Beyond state public policies.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond the formal, official, state institutional, laws, constitution, so on and so forth, is that there seems to be a bias within political philosophy that when we're talking about justice, we're talking about what should the state's laws be, what should the state's constitution be, what should the state's actions be, right? And that kind of bias about justice then kind of gives a weaker view of what the possibilities of politics are. Because if justice is about that, then political action is going to be about changing those policies, right?
Right.
And often it's going to be changing them through the state's own channels. And what we're trying to draw out in that paper, because we're speaking to academic philosophy broadly, it's not just supposed to be to other anarchists, but the thought is, so the way we connect it to anarchism is that obviously within anarchists, there's all sorts of arguments between different kinds of anarchists, even though if you were looking at things just in terms of state policy, in the long run, maybe not in the medium run, but certainly in the long run, anarchists have the exact same policy positions, right? Which is to abolish public policy, which is to, in terms of education policy, to abolish state schools, in terms of foreign policy, to abolish the military, in terms of immigration policy, to abolish the borders, so on and so forth. And so it would seem on those, in that kind of state policy-centric view of politics, that anarchists should be in total agreement politically, right? But of course that's false, because there's a lot more to politics, much more to visions of justice than what state institutions, or even, we could get into this more, or even just legal institutions broadly, what is instantiated by the formal laws. And where the thought here is this kind of broader view of politics, where it also is telling us things about institutions of civil society, institutions of markets, things like that. That is something that would be better for, that's part of the specifically anarchist perspective that really, it just seems obvious, even if for someone who does not agree with other parts of the anarchist perspective, that they should at least have this kind of broader view of justice and politics, so you're not reifying the political in terms of state policies, and you're not reifying justice into basically a policy platform.
Right. So it's obvious from the anarchist perspective why one would want political discourse about justice to go beyond public policy. Mm-hmm. But maybe for the non-anarchists, why is it useful to think from this, what you are calling, not substantively anarchist, but methodological
methodological anarchism. Yeah. And it's methodological anarchism because it's saying to look at politics and justice kind of the way that anarchists do, which is where the state is one institution among many. Perhaps it's a particularly pervasively affecting institution, and that's a reason that even anarchists care about state policies, right? You're not indifferent to it, but it's not like only the state is, as if the state is some institution kind of outside of the rest of society that you just can pull levers on as like a Archimedean point from which you can a
justice making machine.
Machine, that's right. Yeah, and so the thought here for like even non-anarchists is to similarly start to care more about what political philosophy can say for these kind of other features of like these other features of social norms, social institutions, and that perhaps even when we're talking about state policy, there's a question of not just the state policy directly bringing about some institution of justice, not directly instantiating some institution of justice, but what kinds of institutions does it make room for? So Roderick Long has this great short little piece called How Government Solved the Healthcare Crisis. But the healthcare crisis he's talking about there is not the one we're very familiar with, but it's the crisis for some groups of doctors. For some groups of doctors who felt like it was too cheap healthcare because of mutual aid societies, which were kind of providing a non-state social safety net for people to be able to pull their resources together and get healthcare fairly cheaply. And one of the ways that they were able to crush the fraternal societies is to crush the lodge practice, because through certain kinds of regulations about who can and cannot provide health insurance, other ways of tilting the health insurance market in certain ways through state intervention, and also things like state medical licensure laws. And of course, David Beto has a book on this general topic, not just on healthcare. It's called something like From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, I believe. Yeah. And the lesson here being is that these are institutions that are able to provide something that we might think of as an element of distributive justice or social justice in some way, right? But it has nothing to do with the state, right? Mm-hmm. And you might think, well, what is a way for a non-anarchist to incorporate this? And you might say, well, suppose that part of their view is that a just society provides robust provision of healthcare, something like that. Then it might be that the right way to instantiate justice is not that the state directly provides healthcare, but that the state makes room for, is not getting in the way of institutions that can provide health insurance. And then so you might say that as a matter of distributive justice, that you should get rid of like licensure laws and other sorts of regulations that limit who can provide medical services, who can provide health insurance, things like that. That it's not as easily a direct line from state policy to from principles. It's not as direct of a line from principles of justice to state policies. That when we're having conversations about justice, we can't assume, well, if you think X is a principle of justice, then you also believe that some state law saying X must be provided is the right way to go about that. And now, of course, this is going to make anyone's politics, like substantive politics, much closer to anarchism when they're looking at things this way. But
assuming that the empirical story
of
that
course, right,
tell is
right, obviously,
correct.
yeah. But we think it's going to make you a much closer to an anarchist in terms of substantive politics, but it doesn't necessarily. It's a point that one can accept even if they don't accept that. Although obviously, as author of the piece, that's the background I'm coming from with it, right?
So, what you're basically saying is there's this sort of like move that political philosophers, especially academic ones, sometimes make, where they're like, people have a right to this. Mm-hmm. The right is constituted by certain material goods, therefore the state should provide that.
Yes, correct.
There needs to be more empirical support that the state.
Yeah, there needs to be more comparative institutional analysis to say that, and the right way for the society to provide for social institutions to provide this is for to be the state. And I think part of the issue here is that there's this kind of reification of the state as the institution holding up society, right?
Right.
That is...
They're coming from like a Hobbesian framework.
Yeah, exactly. That you might say it's something like the way that some kind of religious institutions will see particular kind of institution as being the way that individual humans interact with God, and that they can't really interact with God except through this particular religious institution.
The church, it's as if, or whatever.
Yeah, it's as if the state is fulfilling some similar role with individuals within a society and society more broadly, that as if there is no way to have any impact on the norms and structure of society except through going through the state. This kind of monopolization of the contestation of social norms is through electoral politics, through lobbying and things, and official legislation and things like that, when part of what we're pushing is to look at politics as this kind of broader sort of contestation that might have very little to do, in many cases, with ever trying in any way to make a change at the level of state policy. That you can have wildly different political structures even if you have the same state structure or absence of a state structure.
Right. So the idea here is that you might have two societies, one that is deeply unjust in terms of how goods and access to political power, etc., access to social influence, or what have you, and another society where it matches any given conception of justice, but they might have the exact same state apparatus.
Exactly. Or absence thereof, right.
Yeah.
Obviously. Yeah, and again, pulling this back, and I think what draws this out really clearly, and part of why, beyond the obvious ways, this is a uniquely anarchist way of looking at it, and kind of why it's just kind of... So, why it's a uniquely anarchist way of looking at it is that if you look at arguments between anarchists, obviously, they might be talking about the exact same legal structures, the exact same absence of a state, obviously,
right.
But they disagree wildly and do not see themselves as basically agreeing, right, on politics.
You have in mind like disagreements between
like
syndicalists, or social anarchists.
Yeah, exactly. So you have
market.
So you have social anarchists, market anarchists, disagreements even within different varieties of social anarchist or market anarchist, right? Mm-hmm. That you might say, well, what's the big difference between like a very particularly right-wing sort of anarcho-capitalist and certain kinds of left-wing market anarchists? Well, they both agree on there being a state, on there not being they both agree on there not being a state. Mm-hmm. They both agree on there being some sort of non-state legal system that's going to allow for some kind of property and money and things like that. Well, what's the real difference here? Isn't it really just a disagreement of culture, not politics? And my thought here is it's hard to imagine really being enmeshed in those conversations and think that there's no real political disagreement there, because clearly there's quite a bit of disagreement about the kind of constitution at the level of social norms. Things like, you can see like kind of like non-state unions as a kind of checks and balances on the power of managers over workers, things like that are clearly at the level of social norms, clearly political, even if it's both operating with the same kind of view about state politics, which is to not have any. Right.
Yeah, and you can run the same disagreements about the role of the family.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and family, other kinds of social norms.
Yeah. So one question that, if I were coming to this from more of a policy framework, if I were thinking, even among anarchists, sometimes the waters get muddy here, is what is the difference between what is just an empirical disagreement about the capacity of non-state institutions to provide for these goods and so on, or disagreements about what sort of social institutions would pervade in the absence of state, and what is the genuine, normative political disagreement here.
Right, yeah. Here's a kind of an example is I recently saw from a blog post from a philosopher who I otherwise very highly respect, but as an example of their disagreement with kind of certain kinds of rights-based libertarianism, they mentioned the kind of anti-libel law position from a lot of rights-based libertarians, and they described this as saying that libel was okay. Right. And this is clearly very sloppy, because just because you don't believe that the law should have something to say about something does not mean that you think it's okay. Does not even mean that you think that social norms and other kinds of social institutions should not greatly check it. And similarly, you might say someone who is criticizing libertarianism, and then they're talking about, well, there would be no protections for certain kinds of
discrimination
against certain kinds of discrimination, against other kinds of job related issues, right? Because you wouldn't have the robust workplace law, right, in the same way. The thought here is, well, maybe you wouldn't have the official legal body called workplace law, right? But you would be able to have robust kinds of social norms that look a whole lot like a legal system of sorts, built up through contestation in the form of labor activism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yellow journalism calling it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So
and I think this might also be a good I'll say more about this in a second, but this might be a good bridge also to talking about how this relates beyond just a conversation between academic philosophers. But I can say more about that being what you're going to say.
Okay. So we'll get to that in a second. If I were operating again within the policy framework, I would think that given the way the empirical facts bear out, and this is probably not the case, but it seems to be the common empirical assumption among mainstream political philosophers, the state is in fact the only capable agent, agent capable of enforcing it. And so I might just think that this whole methodological anarchist project is not going to sway my substantive political policy views. They would say political views, but we should clarify policy views in this context very much.
So I guess the thought there is that the position allows logical space for that.
Right.
However, it kind of makes things harder for you if you want to say that, because then you have to be either do the substantive social scientific work, do the comparative institutional analysis, the history, things like that, where you show that there's very good reason beyond just kind of this loose assumption we make between the laws of a society, the formal laws of a society and its norms, that this is the way to go. Or you could say, I am assuming that this is the case. But even just saying, even a footnote just saying, I am assuming that this is the case, would be bounds better from this perspective than the way a lot of academic political philosophy is done.
So one other concern that an academic political philosopher who's defending the policy framework might have is that it seems like what the state law is expressive and meaningful in certain ways of what the norms are. And so they might not want to engage in that social scientific work because they might think, you especially hear this from conservative-leaning, communitarian-leaning types, or, people like David Miller, some of the nationalists who, Yiltimir, who have you, who think that what the law should be, even if the state isn't necessarily the best agent to do it, it should be expressing certain values in certain ways. And so that even if, the whole social scientific theory doesn't go out their way, we should still maintain something like the policy framework, because something about what the state does is, like, symbolically meaningful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd also say, like, it's not necessarily just communitarians who say this.
Liberals who say this.
Yeah. So I think this is actually a common thread through a lot of philosophy. In fact, Robert Nozick, so he has a piece called The Zigzag of Politics in Examine Life. A lot of people mistakenly say where he abandons libertarianism. That's not quite true. He moderates it. Yeah. Well, I think my understanding is he told David Gordon at one point that basically he had just moved from, like, the old minarchist position to something more like a Hayek type classical liberalism. But in his discussion, he talks about how he says that state laws and institutions, things like the welfare state, that they don't just do something in terms of, like, helping people. Yeah. They also embody certain ties of relational concern.
Or meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And he thinks that there's something defective about a society that doesn't have such... exactly. So I guess what I would want to say to that is that this really intensifies to me why the policy framework seems so bizarre, because it's not clear to me, and this really goes back to what I was saying about how it's as if you're viewing the state as if it's like the church of society in some respect, right? That as if we can only interact with the rest of society mediated through the power of the state. It's not clear to me why we should see this kind of univocal singular voice of society in terms of the state and its laws, that should be more something where we would see kind of a chorus coming out from the society and just the general sense of the social norms.
Yeah, whether policy is top down or
exactly,
bottom up.
Yeah. So there's certainly, for example, to give you an example of, like, bad ways in which the society might voice certain things, is regardless of what our laws are, it's certainly the case that we have major social institutions, in a certain sense, major social institutions like the Washington Redskins, right?
Right.
Where they're essentially using a certain kind of slur as the name of a team, right? And so the fact that I would see, for example, significant social pressure if it were able to affect a change on the name of that, as doing something about the voice of society, irrespective of whether or not the state said anything one way or the other.
Yeah, and sports is a particularly potent example, because we see political disputes in sports arise all the time that has nothing to do with state policy.
Exactly, and similarly...
Same with art, media.
Yeah, in media, it's a very good example. But also, I think, to kind of step back, and we're thinking about those mutual aid societies that I was referring to earlier. I didn't really go into detail, but essentially people are able to pull the resources together and able to do better than any of them could individually. That if you have this, like, robust network of mutual aid societies, it's not clear to me in what sense that is not symbolizing ties of relational concern that the welfare state does, right?
Right. So it's almost as though they're taking a contingent semiotic feature of the way people currently think about society. Yeah. And it's even empirically questionable whether that's far, and essentializing it to this, like, necessary condition of social relationships.
Yeah, and I think that actually draws on another point I would want to make, which is, I think, an unfortunate fact of this kind of, like, policy framework, policy-centric way of looking at politics, is that it kind of, like, builds on itself, right? That once we already have the welfare state, for example, as the way we assume, and I don't think the welfare state is the worst thing about the state, obviously, I want to make that clear, but just using it as an example, that the welfare state is the way that we show that we care about one another, something like that, and then all sorts of other things, it kind of becomes more and more as if, well, what is the way we're used to showing ties of relational concern? Through state laws, right? And the fact that there are not the state laws here, that the state laws are silent, becomes more of a symbol, right? The more and more the state gets involved. So I think another danger of the policy framework is that it can cripple the other sources of moral communication.
Which is, in fact, what happened to mutual aid society.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. What are the other dangers, practical, philosophical, and so on, you see of this framework?
So here's one thing I wanted to make clear is that I don't think this is just, although in the chapter we're obviously talking about it in the terms of like academic political philosophy, I don't think this is just like a mistake of academic philosophers. I think this is something that comes about with people just in general political discourse. That there's this kind of sense of, do you like this thing? Means, do you think that the government should be doing this thing?
Yeah.
Do you dislike this thing? That means the government should ban it. Exactly, right, yeah.
So it's like we start off with, okay, here's a couple features of just, in a way you could see this as undermining like the sort of limited scope of what like Rawls wanted to be political, even in public reason.
Yeah.
So like you start off with like this limited scope of what counts as a political question, and then it just, when you start reifying all communication of social media into the state, it just starts sneaking. So now all of a sudden we're fighting about whether the language we speak should be determined.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So here's a good. And this is not going to be very. It's not going to be as concrete as I would like for it to be, but it's just kind of a general, vague sense about something that bothers me or frustrates me about contemporary political discourse. Is so you take some of the kinds of discourse surrounding the burgeoning democratic socialist movement, and some of it is obviously often very good, right? Some of the district attorney candidates they've been running, some of the anti-carceral
reform,
exactly,
reform of the way the way local DAs go about racially enforcing.
Exactly. But one thing that frustrates me about, and there's sectors of DSA types that are not like this clearly, but especially the libertarian socialist parts of it, but is that there's this kind of assumption of, well, this thing is being done by something other than the state, which that's repulsive. It should be being done by the state, right? So, for example, you have a story about perhaps some anarchist group fixing potholes, or even Domino's fixing potholes or something like that. Like
Pornhub did it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, and then thought here is often not look at the way that society does not depend upon the state. It's as if the fact that it is someone other than the state doing it is a grave moral defect about our society.
Right.
And I think this is kind of a general thought that people have, and that there's a kind of killing the instinct of self-governance that I think better fits with kind of the anti-domination impulses of that kind of movement. And this is this kind of assumption of that if we really cared about this thing, it would be the state caring about it. There's something non-instrumental about that, right? Yeah. Where it's not just we can mobilize forces better this way.
They are in certain ways thinking of it as if like the state doing it is intrinsically valuable for some symbolic reason.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I guess the thought is, I don't think we have enough conversation about what exactly is it that gives people that sense.
Yeah.
And I think when you really press on that, it's less and less obvious what exactly the non-instrumental benefit would be, if anything.
Right. So
I think this is, and again, this is a unique anarchist insight, that it's that there's something more real, almost as if it's coming from the society itself, that we are banding together, that we do not depend upon the state in this or that way.
Yeah. What's that, Pat the Bunny song from Wingnut Dishwashers Union, Prudhomme in Manhattan, where he's talking about, like, anarchists filling potholes to prove...
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common thread in anarchist circles. So if political discussion, both in academic philosophy... Well, before I get to that question real quick, what do you think of what you're doing with this you and Billy are doing with this methodological anarchist project as in line with is like the normative or philosophical version of what's called analytical anarchism among like political economists.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think they're deeply complementary, where the thought is that it's kind of questioning this kind of like categorical separateness of the state and other institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Where we're not where people kind of without argument treat it as if it's like some kind of Archimedean point from which you can like tinker with the rest of society, rather than something that has to that depends on other social norms and things like that. And that the analytical anarchist perspective, as I see it, is basically the kind of the positive social scientific complement to the methodological anarchist perspective.
The legal centralist law and economics model that they're challenging is like the positive wing of the policy framework.
Yeah, that sounds right to me as well.
So if political conversations are not just about what state policy should be, then what are they about?
Yeah, so political conversations, I think. So Gustav Landauer, when he talks about what is the state, he refers to it as just a way that we relate to one another, right?
Right.
And that getting rid of the state would mean relating to one another in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the crux of what I would say that the political is in general, is ways that we relate to one another. Okay. And as part of that, I think the conversation of what is justice, what is political action, is going to similarly be about how should we relate to one another, right? And things about that. It's going to, I think, politics, there's ways this can go very awry, especially if you're doing this with the policy framework as well. But I think politics and ethics kind of bleed into one another much more on an anarchist framework generally.
So I want to press you there, because like one framework that can be divorced from the policy framework that liberal political philosophy has given us, that one might really want to hold on to, is a sense of the public-private distinction. And there are many challenges to this. But this idea that there are some questions that we should properly think of as political, you know, in the policy framework it would be like matters of public policy. And then some that we should think of as not within the purview of politics, the private. So like we don't want to make it a question of broad social concern, what the specific way you relate to your family is. And the certain way, that's like one way it gets cashed out. Or we don't want to make it a matter of broad political concern, what a religious order should look like within a church, or on certain liberal versions this would not be in spirit with anarchism, like what the specific nature of a firm should be or something like that. So how do we, or do you think we should maintain aspects of this public-private distinction even once we get rid of the policy framework and start doing this thoroughly methodological anarchism?
Yeah, so at one time, like several years ago, I would have just thought the public-private distinction was kind of garbage, and that it was yet another instance of liberals who are not libertarians trying to avoid the inevitable libertarian conclusions of liberalism by trying to get the libertarian parts they like without the libertarian parts they don't like through some ham-fisted distinction that doesn't actually make any sense. Now, I would still want to say that I wouldn't want to cash out quite in terms of a public-private distinction, because I think a lot of the kind of illiberal, frankly, criticisms of the public-private distinction are very on point. Things like a lot of feminist criticisms, for example, from people who are more hostile to liberalism generally, that the public-private distinction upholds certain kinds of like patriarchy, things like that. And those are on point insofar as we're really taking the public-private distinction itself to be what's at stake here. What I would want to say is that instead of a public-private distinction, we should have a sense of polycentricity or something like that, where the focus is less about trying to centralize our norms so that we all have the same norms at the same time, but rather and trying to fix all the problems within individual associations that way, and more trying to lead to greater and greater diversity of social interaction, greater diversity of social associations, such that we increase the ability to exit perverse social relationships, and as a result of that, increasing the power of voice within the people engaged in those social interactions, such that since they have this greater power of exit, they are able to more directly challenge it. So for example, it's not necessarily that the family is a part of a private sphere that is free from politics, but rather that there shouldn't be a person who is reordering families from the outside without consulting the people within the family, right? Rather, you should look at it as kind of a more ground-up political, where the people who are best positioned to be making political changes, partly for reasons of likely kind of collateral damage, maybe not literally, but I mean into other kinds of like ups of moral dangers, kinds of collateral damage that someone trying to come in externally would make, other kinds of like standpoint epistemological issues, things like that. The people who are best positioned to be contesting those norms are the people living under them, right? And so it's better, I think, to look at the politics there as trying to empower the people who would be best to contest those norms, rather than doing it from the outside centrally. And so again, I would look at this as more of a polycentricity, monocentricity thing rather than a public-private distinction per se. But again, I think there's something to there's something that they're getting right about the public-private distinction. But if you treat that as the real distinction, I think you're going to run into problems.
So let's go into what you think they're getting right. As I understand it, the reason why liberals, many of them, hold the public-private distinction so central is they view it that it's just a fact that you're not going to get everyone within a social order to agree on everything. Fact of reasonable pluralism, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And so we should be modest in the sorts of concerns that we want to address just to make society capable of pulling together without resorting to violence. If we start... Like, they would typically say things like, if you start undermining the public-private distinction, making what happens within a church, you're going to lead to wars of religion in certain ways. And I don't see how even once we start to get outside of the policy framework where it's not a single monolithic agent enforcing those sorts of, like, legal norms within a church or something like that, and now all of a sudden it just feels like anyone is free to criticize any aspect of anyone else's... I mean, clearly they should be like negatively free to do that, but it's viewed as appropriate and, in some sense, ethically and socially, I don't want to say obligatory, but praiseworthy, if you will, to do that sort of thing, that it might lead to the same sorts of political conflicts that one would want to avoid in any just political order. Do you think that maintaining something like a public-private distinction, even within an anarchist framework, is necessary to mitigate that? Or would you think that just viewing it... And another reason one might want to do it is there are different spheres of society where we should apply different sorts of moral norms in certain ways. Like, I have in mind, like, Hayek's distinction between the extended and intimate order here. Do you think that those concerns are mitigated while in some sense abandoning it and just viewing this as a polycentric way of addressing nominally private social interactions? Or do you think that there's a way that those concerns should be, those genuinely liberal concerns should be accommodated within thinking about this?
So feel free to interrupt me or just tell me if I'm not responding to the question quite the way you're thinking of it. But part of the reason I think monocentricity, polycentricity is really more the crux of this issue than public-private per se is, why do we care so much about this public distinction, this public realm not being a particular conception of the good or whatever, it's because we suspect, or we expect, it's because we expect that there's a danger of someone else kind of enforcing their particular view of the good on us.
That someone else could be the state, or it could be
right, correct. Or it could be
polycentrically organized. I don't want to say mob, but you get the picture.
Yeah. No, but again, so I think I don't want to say that polycentricity is just a question of state versus non-state, right?
Right. Yeah.
So if you had just one kind of civil association for something, that's still very hierarchical, still like
looks like the Catholic Church or whatever. Yeah.
I'm trying to avoid any kind of specific examples there, but yeah, so that it's possible that would still have the same kind of problem, right? Where it matters a whole lot more to you what their policies are, because it's going to be policies for you necessarily, right? Whereas with polycentricity, you're going to have culture war stuff, but it's not going to be the threat of someone imposing it through violence per se. It's going to be centralizing it. It's going to be the day-to-day life being contested by people you're actually in association with. Now, here's something like the public-private distinction that's not the public-private distinction that might be also speak to the issue, is that when we're engaged with, and by the way, I just want to note, this is an area where I have not got nearly as clear thoughts on as I would like to have,
right.
But it's something that I'm thinking a lot about recently. So this is kind of in flux, but it's good to have this conversation, is that with different people that we interact with in our lives, we interact with them for certain kinds of purposes, right?
You interact with the baker for different reasons than you interact with your mom.
Yeah, with your mother, or with
your priest,
or your coworkers, so on and so forth. And you might think that you might focus on the things that are relevant to that interaction, right? And when you're contesting terms of that interaction, right? And you think, what is it that makes it such that this is an interaction I am happy with? And that's maybe something that's like the thing to center on when you're contesting norms, is what are the reasons you're interested in interacting with this person, and making sure that those are solid. You don't have to be contesting all social norms at all times.
Okay. And
that starts to look like kind of a polycentric equivalent of a public-private distinction, but I don't think it's the same thing, right? Because it might matter to you, right? If there's something particularly bigoted about someone you're interacting with in some way, right?
You found out the baker turned away.
Yeah, exactly. Then that's relevant to your terms of interaction, right?
Right. So it's almost like it's not like there's one public-private distinction, but a whole host of them that apply to.
Yeah. It's not, and again, it's not really a public-private distinction. It's more of a terms of this interaction, things that are not related to this interaction.
Yeah, and I have in mind another thing that.
And it's not as if the things that are outside of this interaction are not moral issues, because they are. It's more of just a practical matter of what are the things that it makes sense for you to be contesting in this space, right? And is the issue here more something where you should be making space for the people who should be empowered to contest it, or are you the one who is in the best position to be contesting the norm here?
Yeah. I don't want to dwell on this issue too much, but one issue that one might have with not having clear norms for what one should consider the terms of certain ideal types of interactions that they have, that would begin to look more like a traditional public-private distinction, is it sort of fractures, like I have in mind like the sort of thing Alexei Marcoux might say here. It sort of fractures certain sorts of interactions in ways that the sort of people you want to interact with become more insular to yourself.
I see.
So, like, now we have a market economy, or it doesn't have to be a market economy, whatever the ideal type of economic exchange is, only for people who have, like, Christian beliefs, and then another one that's for others, and everyone loses out on rich sorts of both economic and social interaction that they could benefit from.
I see. That's interesting. So I'm not familiar with that person's work.
Yeah.
But I guess my thought here would be that, and this is part of the reason that, one of many reasons that I'm decidedly a market anarchist,
right,
is I think that might be true if the kinds of associations that we're engaged with are strictly these kind of more direct, like gift economic or directly kind of resource pooling interactions, right? But it's less
now you have
true.
A mutual aid society and a commune only for people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas it seems like that's just going to be inherently unstable under any kind of commercial economy, where it's just extremely unlikely that without some kind of violence or some like really super strong social norm holding that division together, that it's not going to be individually rational to engage with people, and that when you have that engagement, that's going to lead to greater and greater
so you're making an empirical bet that markets are decentering of insular social interactions.
Yes, exactly.
And that may or may not cash out, but under current existing markets, we do see people engaging in what Alexei Marco calls the market for values, where they're like, now you can have iPhone apps to check like the political stances of whoever you're buying from the grocery store, so you can scan it to see like what the CEO of that company or the board of that company.
Right.
So there might be ways that it could stand up even in a market framework.
Yeah. So the thought. So I guess my thought is though that like that when you're that I don't have to agree with someone who my interaction with is that I get a cup of coffee from them. I don't have to agree with them on everything, right? There's going to be some things that are going to be deal breakers, right? But I don't have to agree with them on everything. Whereas if I live this is a bit of a straw man, but if I live in a giant commune where we do everything together, right, it's going to matter a whole lot more to me that we're like neck and neck.
So markets make the terms naturally
more flexible.
More flexible. What's the Adam Ferguson or Adam Smith? I forget which quote. It's a mutual exchange on minimal terms.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the best people to read on this, honestly, are like really culturally conservative critics of the market, because they're going to they will see like economic liberalism and social liberalism go together, right? Because you're not going to be able to restrain social liberalization when you have the market undercutting the kinds of ties that have that kind of ironclad agreement, right? Because there's increasing flexibility on the terms of interaction, that it's just harder to have robustly inegalitarian, robustly hierarchical, stagnant norms. That they're always going to have to be adapting, and that they're going to be adapting specifically in the direction of greater openness.
Right.
And that's part of the reason that I think markets are so good.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I just wanted to put a plug in for the center and all the great work my colleagues do there. If you are enjoying this conversation, you can read and listen to more about the theory and practice of market anarchism at c4ss.org. There are years' worth of articles, books, and zines on current events, philosophy, politics, and economics of anarchist theory. There are also books, essay collections, and swag available at the C4SS store at store.c4ss.org that you can check out as well. This show and everything else the Center does would not be possible without our generous donors and patrons. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ssdotorg. I'll have more information about how you can support the show and the rest of the Center's projects on Patreon at the end of this episode, as well as the bonus goodies you get for doing so. But for now, here's the rest of this episode. So if we get outside of this policy framework and we start not thinking about the crux of political disagreement is about disagreements about state policy, and maybe this becomes obvious from the conversation we just had, but what is politics about? What are theories of justice about?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally about the terms of interaction that we have, the ways things about what is it the right way to relate to other people, right? There's other parts of morality that I think are actually have very little to do with interacting with other people. They're entirely self-regarding parts of morality, but in terms of justice, and there's even parts of interacting with other people that I think are not quite issues of justice, but in terms of justice, it's about the terms of interaction for social institutions and social norms, right? So things like so for example, how do we have norms such that fundamentally I am not in any kind of robust kind of authority over you, even if I'm in a kind of maybe like a kind of I am in a position where I'm making a decision, I'm still not, you're still not a lesser person than me, right, in the terms of interaction.
Relational egalitarianism.
Yeah, exactly, a relational egalitarianism, but it's not just that we're all equal through equal regard by the state.
Or equality before the law.
Exactly, it's equality.
Or equal access to distributive goods.
It's equality through the norms of our everyday life. And that's going to be very complex depending on the situation. But one thing that I think is especially important, and this is unsurprising for a libertarian background, is that I think part of relating to one another as equals, a necessary constitutive part of it is some kind of what people sometimes call self-ownership, or you might call self-sovereignty, and we're therefore relating to one another without aggression, right? That we don't take it to be the case that I can just violently redirect your aims into something that I think would be better. That I have to engage with you through reasoned discourse or through other kinds of non-violent social persuasion.
So a principled moral presumption against the initiation of violence.
Exactly.
Okay. So there are two questions that come out of that answer. One, what do you mean by violence? Because there's clear disagreement among even libertarians of different stripes about what is meant by that. And we'll hopefully get to the second one. What do you do if your presumption against violence goes against what you think is required of relational egalitarianism?
I see. Interesting.
Let's tackle the first one first.
Yeah. I think they're both big questions, but I think the second one is a bit more complex. So the first. So
what do you mean by violence?
Yeah. So what is violence? So this is actually a project that I'm kind of working on, as you know this.
Yeah.
But this is a project I'm in the very early stages of, and less so than the thing I was just talking about, but still very much in flux. So these are not settled opinions, but I think first of all, it's an important question to ask, because when people talk about the kind of rights-based libertarianism, they'll often talk about, well, it involves the non-initiation of force. And it's kind of taken for granted that we all know what force is, right, in that conversation.
Or violence.
Yeah. That there's a question of, like, is that the right principle or not? But it's not, okay, well, what does that actually mean concretely? And I think it's important to ask that question because I think both it's some of the seemingly really obvious answers actually aren't going to work, and that it's going to matter for a lot of kind of downstream questions, right? So you might think, for example, that just any unwanted physical contact is what constitutes violence, right? But that's not. So I think that's not going to work for a couple reasons. So, like, one, I'll say why this matters, which is there's this criticism sometimes by libertarians who don't buy the natural rights framework, and sometimes by critics of libertarianism, where the thought is, look, like, libertarians, they tend to believe in this non-aggression stuff, but they also believe in property rights. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense in which if I am...
And they believe in defensive violation.
Yes, exactly.
Defensive violence
correct.
If a violation of property rights.
Yes. And the property rights include the right to forcibly defend your property, right? Mm-hmm. There's issues of proportionality, but still some violence is warranted.
In certain cases.
Yeah. And the thought is, look, if I'm just taking a lot of stuff that you say belongs to you, I'm not touching you in any way. I'm not doing violence to you. Mm-hmm. So the person who brings the violence into the situation is you when you try to grab me and get the stuff out of my hands, mm-hmm. right? And so either non-aggression is, this is the challenge, is that it seems like either non-aggression is going to count against property if we look at it in that naive way, or we might say, look, when I say non-aggression, I'm also assuming this theory of property rights. But at that point, it seems like non-aggression isn't really doing the work, mm-hmm. right?
It's the theory of property.
Yeah, exactly. And what I want to say is that neither of those things is true, and rather it's that we should reconceive the way we look at violence. Mm-hmm. Because I think this is kind of assuming kind of a naive, unwanted physical contact mm-hmm. view of violence. And I think unwanted physical contact is definitely part of it. But part of the reason that unwanted physical contact can't be the full story is it doesn't really distinguish between the recipient and the violence and the attacker in quite the way we would want to say it does. So say that I am hurling at you, right, full speed ahead, but I want you to get out of the way, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to keep going whether or not you get out of the way. And so I want you to get out of the way, but I'm going to keep doing it regardless. And if I crash into you, there's a sense in which obviously it's unwanted physical contact from me to you, right? But there's also a sense in which it's unwanted physical contact from you to me, right? That I didn't want to have that physical contact. But clearly we want to say that the person engaged in violence in that situation was me, right?
So if you're driving a car and I happen to be standing in front of
yes.
you to make the situation a bit more concrete, and you hit me, we want to say that you had the obligation to slam the brakes and not hit me or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so
you're the one initiating.
Yeah, and we want to say that. Yeah, we want to be able to say that there's like an objective ordering of violence here, right? Such mm-hmm. that when violence occurs, there is a person who brought the violence, right? And what I want to say...
I mean, some people don't want to
say That's true. So Peter Gelderloos, for example, in Failure of Nonviolence, claims that violence is just a completely...
expressive, sort of.
Yeah, he claims that it's... That's what we're looking for here. That he has kind of what we might think of as like a nominalist view of violence, where it's like that it's just kind of a word we slap onto things that we don't like, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of like... Anyway... And similarly, some critics of libertarianism, like Matt Brunig, would kind of see any kind of conflict over resources involving violence on both sides, in that they're both trying to use the thing in the way that the other party doesn't want. But I'm going to say, no, I think we're right to assume that there has to be some kind of objective ordering of violence. And the way I'm going to look at it is, so when we take actions in the world, there's physical manifestations of those actions, right? Mm-hmm. When I'm crossing the street, so we're talking about just purely bodily issues. When I'm crossing the street, the physical manifestation, when I'm crossing the street, the physical manifestation of that is my body moving across the street, right? Right. And so, but when I'm doing that and no one's around, right? I'm clearly not, assuming other stuff, right, I'm clearly not disrupting any previous action. I'm taking a purely mm-hmm. Non-invasive action. But if someone else comes along and stops me from crossing the street in some way, then that person has, with their action, concretely, physically prevented the concrete physical manifestation of the action I am in the middle of taking, right? And so I think that's the kind of the core case of violence. But what I want to observe about it is that the concrete physical manifestations of our actions don't necessarily have to directly involve our bodies per se, right? Mm-hmm. So if I am, for example, if I set up a house, right, for myself, then and I'm living in it, so on and so forth, then it seems like there's an action that I'm taking with this building, namely that I'm living in it, right? Yeah. And it's not the concrete physical manifestation of that action is not just my body; it's also the stuff that I'm doing with the house, right?
And you could say the same about your laptop, toothbrush.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Phone, whatever. And again, assuming everything else, that this is an action that's not disrupting any prior physical action from someone else. So then when someone else comes along and disrupts that action physically, concretely in some way, that person is bringing the conflict to the scene, and that person, I think we can say that person has initiated violence. And when I do something to prevent that disruption, when I try to disrupt their disruption, there's an objective ordering here, right? Yeah. Such that my violence is defensive and theirs was aggressive. And the final thing I want to observe here is notice that because we're allowing for the physical manifestation of the action to involve things beyond just your body, we get that as the grounding of the property rights. So we're not kind of just like ad hoc stipulating a theory of property rights onto it. We're getting the theory of property rights out of unpacking what it means to engage in an action, and out of what it means to violently disrupt the action. Is that the property is when the stuff you can't mess with without physically disrupting the physical manifestation of someone's action.
So let's just take a basic case of bodily interaction and see how this theory works for it.
Yeah.
You're walking across the street, I'm walking across the street. We're obviously not presupposing any theory who has the prior right, and we're both simultaneously initiating our plans.
Right. I see.
And then we run into each other.
Yeah, so I don't actually know what I would want to say about that case specifically. It seems like you might say that both parties are engaged in, like, faultless violence.
Like, what I would want to say is nobody's initiated violence. You just ran into each other.
I mean, I think that's like another possibility.
But can you say that?
Yeah, I kind of know. I guess I don't see there being a lot of practical upshot between saying that neither of them initiated violence versus both of them faultlessly initiated violence, except in the following way, which I think would incline me towards the faultlessly initiated violence sense, which is that if somebody else sees that this is about to happen, right, they can kind of grab you, right, and stop you from running into me, or grab me and stop me from running into you. And that
he initiated.
When that person is stopping, is preventing the violence, right? And they're stopping the violence that's kind of en route to happening. And it seems like we don't want to say that person has initiated violence per se. It seems like they're doing something defensive of both parties, right?
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so change it up.
And one more point, I just want to note something that's important about this also is that it doesn't require moral fault per se,
right?
To even for someone who has initiated violence. It just is because again, that's an instance where there's nothing that you were doing right that was morally wrong. It's just this is regulating when we're able to use force to stop you.
Okay. So the other type of case I have in mind is you have your head buried in your phone. I am looking ahead. I see you're about to walk into me. I don't get out of the way. Can I be said to have initiated violence, or you?
Oh, that's a more interesting case.
You have an obligation. I'm building up the complexity here.
Right, that's a more interesting case.
Counterexamples.
Yeah.
Because again, I would want to say no one has initiated violence, or I would want to say.
I kind of might want to say that if you just see it's about to happen and you're standing in my way...
But I'm also standing in your way. We have both simultaneously initiated the plan, so there's no non-arbitrary way to say
You might want to say...
Supposing I have the resources to get out of your way, one might have the intuition to say...
Here's what I might want to say about that case. But I think this is a good case. It's something to need to think more about. Is that there's something where the person who is standing in the way, what I'm inclined to say is that the person standing there, that they are preventing something that it's kind of like a foregone conclusion that the person walking is going to reach that point, right? And it's not like the person walking, because you're saying that they're like distracted in some way, right? That it's not like they're really in a position to change course in quite the right way. So I might want to say that it's... I might want to say that it's on the person standing there. But I actually am not 100% set on that. Because also you want to say that there's possibility for like negligence, right, in the person not looking up at their phone. It's not. It's not like it's not like they're hurling through the air, right? Yeah. It's they literally could look up, right, and
you want to say that they have the responsibility to be
So I think this is an interesting case, but I do want to say that outside of these kind of like edge cases, that there's a lot of like stuff we can do with more paradigm cases, right?
Yeah, right.
That this doesn't tell us whether this doesn't count against the point in terms of getting the kind of answer on the property stuff. It doesn't change it in terms of like there being an objective ordering.
Yeah, but it does change it in terms of whether you need to add something to the theory of violence.
That's true. That
might have downstream effects.
That's true. But it's not immediately obvious what the downstream effect would be.
That's fair.
And I see this as different than...
And also, it seems like an intuition that you should want to capture is that a bystander could, without being said to initiate violence, either pull me who's standing there out of the way, or you who's buried in your phone. Continuing to walk. So again, I think I want to emphasize this is a very early stage of this project. Right. But I still think that this is not as pervasive of a problem as the problem I raised with the kind of the naive, unwanted physical contact. I think that's right, yeah.
View, because that, I think, it's in all interactions. It's like that. Whereas this, it's like a special case of the kind of interaction.
Yeah. I think that's right.
But yeah, I think you're definitely right. And there, you can even get, and then this is something I kind of did actually want to get into, which is that because it's focused on actions, one pervasive feature of the view is that because it's focused on actions and disrupting actions.
And physical actions at that.
Yeah, and physical actions, but not just physical actions. It's not, it's going to sound silly, but not physical actions interpreted super physicalistically. Because it's not just, there's something in the physicalness itself that makes it an action. It has to involve like interpretations of the thing that the person is doing. And that interpretation is going to necessarily be in kind of like a social framework.
Okay.
Right? What is it? I think that kind of the standards of what it involves for you to be in a certain kind of action are always socially somewhat in flux. Because the what exactly it means, the standard way in which someone owns a certain kind of property, what the use is that they're making of it is kind of be in flux, right? It's going to involve interpretation. And for that reason, I think property rights are a little bit more in flux than I think a lot of Lockean libertarians, which I would roughly place myself in the camp of, would really be comfortable saying at first blush. But I think that that's actually good, because I think there's some issues that it's easier to deal with when you note that what exactly the bounds of the property rights are always in like contestation. That it's not like and this kind of relates back to the methodological anarchism stuff, that it's not like you just get, here's the property title. Here's what the state says. This is your property line. It's from this exact, like, GPS coordinate to this exact GPS coordinate.
Right.
No, it's what is the way in which we can see people to be using this thing, right? And what is
and if this project is successful, then you have completely undermined, like, was it Samuel Friedman? I want to say it was, who has that whole, you have no rights to any economic resources that you have because it's just a function of what the state institutions are.
So that's so that's a lot of analytic political philosophy people, and I think Freeman probably says that, but I think the people who are most known for it are Nagel and
Nagel's who I was thinking.
There's somebody, and Liam Murphy, I want to say.
Yeah, Nagel was who I was thinking.
Yeah, but like a lot of people cite this kind of view.
Yeah.
And I think it's also related to that, where it's that property rights are not just a function of like state laws. What that view actually gets right is that property rights are a function of certain kinds of social norms, but social norms, as we're getting back to methodological anarchism stuff, are not something that just extend from the state like as proclamations. Social norms are something that are always built up from the ground up. It's just that the state,
we want to say they're constrained in certain ways by non-state moral considerations.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're always in contestation, right? So you think of like the kinds of property rights, the certain kinds of like common property that get bulldozed over. I mean, not literally at the time, obviously, no bulldozers, but bulldozed over with the enclosure.
You have the type of things Carson.
Yeah, the stuff that Carson talks about in those parts of a mutualist political economy and many other places. That those are really property rights violations, right? Because there really were property rights.
So let's get into this real quick, because you mentioned a minute ago that you view yourself as in some way defending something like neo-Lockean libertarian.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the way you're framing it sounds a lot like an occupancy and use framework that social anarchists would endorse. So I have...
some social anarchists,
Some. Yeah. Maybe not social anarchists, but...
Yeah.
Definitely non-neo-Lockean. Definitely non-Lockean party. So you've grounded this idea of what violence is in an agent positively physically disrupting the physical manifestation of a previously existing action of an agent.
It's a mouthful, I understand.
It sounds like that is at the core of what occupancy and use is. So I am currently using something that gives me a physical manifestation that is the action that is my manifestation. So now that if you were to start physically disrupting that, you come in and start taking my toothbrush, or you come in and start taking my house when I am currently occupying it, then you have initiated violence and I haven't. Now I have, the right to violently defend it with all these proportionality constraints.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to get all the things that neo-Lockeans want to defend, like absentee landlord ownership, absentee property investment in land. And also it doesn't look like... So on the one hand, it might not be getting as much as you think you're thinking. And on the other hand, it might be getting too much, because one might think that intellectual property in certain ways has a physical manifestation sometimes of my actions.
Yeah.
And so if I were to start physically doing things like copying CDs that I have intended to only sell myself, we'll get into that later, but first, why isn't the specific view you're defending not just a basic occupancy and use?
So here's what I want to say. So I have a kind of an older piece on this with C4SS. I think it's something like how Rothbardians occupy a part of the occupancy and use spectrum, or something like that. And what I want to say is, I think that the occupancy and use view is actually like totally right in terms of at the level of like abstract principle, that occupancy and use is the only like justification of property, right?
Right.
That it's not like you do something to something, and then this like throws some like moral goo on it such that now like this is owned by you, that it's not. You could make a metaphor here with like dogs that I'll let listener derive for themselves, but it's more that it is in some sense currently under use by you, that I think that's the right picture. Now, and this might be strange because, as you're saying, like that's typically a view associated with, depending on your levels of stringency, some social anarchists, or mutualists, right? Who might say, yeah, you're gonna have robust markets, and you're gonna have what Tucker would call private property. Benjamin Tucker's gonna call private property, and then some social anarchists would want to restrict it even more, right? Their understanding of like occupancy and use. But what I want to observe is that difference between social anarchists and the Tuckerite mutualist shows that there's a spectrum of interpretation of what it means to be using something.
Right.
And no mutualist is going to want to say the kind of thing that they get accused of sometimes by other libertarians who have like discovered mutualism for the first time, where it's the thing is, well, if you go out to the store, you're not using your house.
Right, yeah.
And so now anybody can just move in there.
If you're not currently brushing your teeth.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And what I want to say is, yeah, the mutualist is right to say that
what counts as current use is more than I am physically.
Yes,
right
exactly.
here at this moment.
There's kind of an ongoing project you have associated with the object, right? But what I also want to say is that once we look at it in that less directly physicalistic way, it's going to be hard to draw a hard line between that and some of the kinds of property that some mutualists are going to want to exclude, right? So,
including like financial instruments.
Yeah, exactly.
And absentee land.
Yeah. Now, again, though, I do want to say that because it's not just like having placed some special moral goo onto the thing where it's just now yours.
You have in mind like how homesteading is usually interpreted.
So the thing is that I actually think the way that homesteading is interpreted is ambiguous between what I'm kind of saying and this kind of
the moral
like
goo.
Yeah, the moral goo type view, where it's okay. Hold on. So because it's not this moral goo view, though, there still has to be some kind of serious like ongoing action that you're involved with, it, right? So, for example, say you have a rental property. I think that it has to be a reasonable interpretation of your action that you are like making an effort to make the place like livable. So here's a good analogy. So you think of like hotels, right?
Right.
Clearly, it's, even though there's other people occupying the individual rooms, it's really obvious to us, assuming it's like a normal hotel, that the hotel is making the whole building.
Hotel owner.
Yeah, is making the whole building in some kind of ongoing use.
Because they're continually cleaning it.
Yes, they're continually cleaning it. They're continually making it a livable space, so on and so forth. There's a recognizable ongoing use with that physical stuff, right? That they're making as an ongoing way, and so the rental arrangement is going to be a little bit different, but I think it's the same general principle where a landlord here's an example of a landlord arrangement that's, I think, not going to be justified.
Okay.
On my view of property, is say that I just own, or say the laws allow this a relationship to be the way we think about it, is that I own this house. I've never been to this house. I don't send anybody out to this house to clean it up or anything. I just like have this property title. The only way I ever enforce it is that when someone is using it in ways that go against what I would want to be the case with it,
like using drugs on it or whatever.
Yeah. Is that I send people with guns to get them off of it. I don't want to say that kind of use is really using it, where it's just getting the rent out of it, right? Meanwhile, I do want to say that if I, as a landlord, am actually making it a livable place, so that after this tenant leaves, it'll be a place where some other tenant could live realistically, and that there's that I'm making it a livable space.
So I take responsibility for
yes,
repairing
exactly.
the
You
pipes,
take exactly that kind of thing.
Clearing the driveway.
Yeah. I think that there's something that without some bare minimum, and I think notably, this is going to be a space of social contestation, is what that bare minimum involves. But without that bare minimum, then literally, it's just like the property claim would be some kind of aggression, right? Because it's not really a use other than just the extracting the rent out of it, right?
What about like land speculation?
So land speculation.
My only intended use is future sale of it.
Yeah. So my thought there.
But I might kick off squatters.
My thought there is that it seems like in that case, you're still going to be, maybe not in the same robust kind of way, doing some degree of upkeep with the land, right? Where you're going to be trying to make it so that it is saleable in the future.
That would be very minimal.
So we might be thinking of more different.
Okay, I have in mind. So like I have a plot of land in the middle of nowhere. Well, we'll play with two cases. I have a plot of land in the middle of nowhere. I'm expecting at some point in the future the value of this to go up, maybe because a national park opened nearby, and I'm expecting maybe a campground might want to open up there. Yeah, and there's next to nothing I'd have to do to make it so that someone could buy it in the future. Yeah. Now, I also might be owning a vacant lot of land in like Detroit or Portland or something like that, and I'm expecting property values to go up. There is next to nothing I'd have to do other than stopping someone else from building something there that the next tenant might not want, or the next owner might not want.
Yeah, so I would want to say that
in that case, the only upkeep I'm doing is the initiation of defensive force, which is exactly the claim in question.
Right. You might want to say that there's some kind of
future-based intention seems to be the only thing grounding it, and you want to avoid that answer, right?
Right. You might want to say that there's a difference between keeping it saleable, right, versus just like that you're extending your resources towards keeping it saleable in a way that's different from just the charging the fee for use, and that it might actually end up being some issue of time, weirdly, that might be a thing that's socially contestable.
Yeah, so how long can you
exactly.
speculate with it?
Yeah. So it might be a time issue where there's a difference between keeping it saleable versus just you're intending to like just extract rents from the fact that you have this claim, right?
And you're expecting it to go up in the future.
Yeah.
But like to really justify land speculation, you need that notion of time to be quite expansive, maybe even
that's
unlimited.
True. Yeah. Well, I don't know about unlimited.
At least like within a lifetime or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think my sense is that with different cases of land speculation, I might go different ways.
Okay.
Is my sense. And so, for example, a lot of land speculation, they're still going to be using the land towards some end, right? Like they might be like, so for example, a lot, you might actually like be paving it in some way that like it'll be amenable to someone who wants to use it in the future, right? And that might be different than
cutting the lawn or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Stopping trees from growing.
Yeah, that sort of thing might be more robust use than the kind of thing that I'm wanting to rule out.
What about conserving land just for like the natural resources?
Yeah, so I think that's gonna be an issue where I'm genuinely gonna have to punt on, because I think land conservancies or environmental conservancies, that's just a very hard issue.
I don't even mean environmental conservancy. It might also include speculation about some mineral or something that's on the land.
I see.
You're not mining it now. It might not even be accessible with current technology, but you expect that in the future it might become valuable.
I see. You might want to say that if the person is like making an ongoing effort of keeping it such that they will be able to mine it when it's available in the future, that might be something.
But again, that ongoing effort is probably just going to be instantiated by defensive.
I see the problem.
Defensive violence that you want to avoid.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Or that is in question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, violence. Yeah, protecting the claim at the very least.
And protecting the claim is the thing that's in question.
Right. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. So I think. So I do want to say that I think nature is not the question you're asking. But
right.
Nature.
I think it was included in the question.
Right, but nature conservation stuff, I think that's just a genuinely very hard problem that I don't have really clear answers myself on. That I'm inclined to say that there's some kind of action that with the nature conservation that you're engaged in, but then it becomes very hard to say what's substantively different. And that might be the sort of thing that is just going to ultimately bottom out in some kind of social interpretation, right? Where, stepping back, realistically, it seems like paradigm cases of a nature conservation case where it's a real thing, that's really what's going on here, versus someone is just kind of bullshitting you and saying that it's a nature conservation.
So you would think,
it seems that those are going to be socially interpretable differently, and this is dangerous territory.
I see the point,
but you might say that the distinction really does just bottom out into some kind of standards of social interpretation that will only emerge through the actual cases coming about.
There's one concern.
The mining case though seems a little bit different, but you say what you were going to say.
Sorry, so. One concern one might have with that is that begins to look very arbitrary and socially contingent. Yes. I don't have that concern personally, but some might.
Yeah.
So there are certain socially interpretable things that seem non-trivial for nature conservations, like contracting with zoos to bring animals who are bred in captivity of endangered species onto the land, maintaining continual scientific study of what the species are doing on the land. That begins to gesture towards a non-arbitrary notion of new use.
And my thought there is that, but settling what... So it's not literally just we decide this versus we decide this.
Yeah.
But there's an element of that, right, which is how we're interpreting the bringing on the animals, how we're interpreting bringing on the certain plants, so on and so forth.
Or even just monitoring and studying.
Yeah, exactly. How we're interpreting that action is going to involve some degree of social... interpretation.
Okay, so you were mentioning...
And I want to make the kind of a broad point here, which is, so you said the worry about social contingency, and it's definitely a worry to have because you don't want, because what I see I can talk about this more in a bit if we want, but I don't want to go on a tangent. But I just want to flag. There's reasons that Lockean is just kind of I think the least misleading term here, but I have worries with the term for the various reasons.
Given the way Locke is usually interpreted,
it
sounds like some people might say it's misleading.
Yeah. So the worry that leads someone to what I would say the right things about Lockean view is you don't want to have the view where property is just totally socially contingent. There's no objective facts about the matter. It just happens to be that that we happen to get more social utility out of property, or even we might say we get more positive freedom out of property, right? So on and so forth. And that's all it is. It just
we the restrict only reason we care about property is because of a certain set of empirical claims.
Yeah. And what I want to say is, those are all great things about property. Right, especially that it increases people's positive freedom. However, I don't want to say that it's just a negative freedom, positive freedom trade-off. I want to say that there's some real sense in which property is consistent with that. It's not just a blunt, brute trade-off. That there's some non-arbitrary basis for it, but there's certain indeterminacies in that non-arbitrary basis is that it's a way that people's actions are in the world So respecting their actions will involve using the physical world in certain ways. Now, the thing is that interpreting human actions is going to be a social project. But notice that the social element of it doesn't come in at the level of justification.
Yeah,
it comes in at the level of interpretation
and implementation.
Yeah, exactly. The issue is that what's justifying it is the physical act, is that we're able to use the world in this way. The social element is not justifying that we're able to use the world in this way. It's in interpreting what it means to be using the world in certain ways.
There was a lot,
and that's not just voluntaristic.
Yeah,
like that's going to involve actual substantive points of debate.
Yeah. So there was a lot in that response that will get us into the second question I had way earlier about what do you do when your stature of violence conflicts with the claims of relational or distributive justice that you have.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to talk about the intellectual property stuff.
Flagging that, it also gets into that a little bit. Flagging that, there was something you wanted to say about the mining case that was different.
Oh, what did I want to say about the mining case that was different? It seems like there's a really particular purpose of what you're wanting to do with the space, right? That's not just having the space, right? It's something that you're actually wanting to do with
the resources in that
space. Yeah, the resources in that space, where it's like, say that I pave like a little plot of land, right, in a way that like is recognizably like a place where you're going to build like a restaurant. Say that. Okay. I don't have the stuff to make the restaurant yet, but I have paved it in that way. It's obvious that I'm on a path here to the thing I've already physically done with it, paving it in that way, is part of this project, such that there has to be some kind of like waiting period where you have to allow for the possibility of getting the resources to do the thing, right? Now here's a separate question, which is what does it mean to be waiting to getting the further resources? What does that waiting period look like? And that's going to be another spot of social contestation, I think, because you don't want to say, I think, I am holding off this space in lieu of very like wild technological predictions that might not come in like a couple thousand years or something like that, right? That in and of itself, at least, is not going to be the answer. That might be a justified thing if you're doing other stuff with it, right? But it seems like that becomes questionable in a way that I am clearing this plot of land, and now I am making arrangements with this land that I've cleared, right? So it has you've made your physical mark, right? That
you've pissed, as it were.
Well, I don't want to say it's like the goo, because it's not like it sticks there irrespective of your action, but you've incorporated it into your action, right?
Yeah, and I need to continue to piss others.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
I was thinking more.
Yeah,
I'm being glib.
No, I know. That I'm making sure. I think that's analogically. Yeah, that sounds analogically right. But and then there's a difference between just the brute, like, speculative, pending, like, bizarre technological advantages that might not happen in like several thousand years, versus I am about to start building this restaurant.
Is inheritance justified on this view?
Inheritance is justified on this view in the following way, which is that so let me say one reason that I think why inheritance rubs people the wrong way, and how this view shows that that's not really the issue. That issue is that people think of, well, you want to say that people get their wealth because they've done something, right? And
like desert views of property.
Yeah, desert views, or like the way you might read Locke, where it's like, well, you made this, right? The person didn't make anything, right, with the inheritance. But you might say, no, it's a kind of an action that you're taking. And I want to say, there's certain kinds of actions where the follow-through of the action, we might be dead while it's still happening, right? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't change the fact that it's part of the action that we put our agency into, right? That your agency is still bound up. So if I put a trust such that I want my money to go to C4SS or something when I die, mm-hmm. my agency is still bound up with that will, as we say, right? Mm-hmm. That my will is being executed even after I'm dead. And that at the ends of your action might be after the ends of your life in some cases. And in the inheritance case, the end of the action is moving the resource into the possession of this other person and incorporating it into their action so they're able to use it as they want.
So using physical violence to disrupt the transfer of inheritance intergenerationally or after the death of someone or what have you counts as violence on this view because it's a matter of respecting the physical manifestation of the action of someone who's dead.
Yes, exactly. Now. Yes.
We might want to say respecting the autonomy of someone who's dead, but I think to put it in phrases that we're familiar with physical manifestation.
And I think that's exactly the right way we want to look at it, where it's who is the person who has the most reason to be upset when a will is distorted. Well, of course, obviously the intended recipient of it to some degree, but really the reason that we care about it is because you are abusing the will of the person who
passed.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so on to the first of the second questions. We're a long time here. But why is and maybe this became clear as we unpack that. Why is intellectual property not viewed as in a way that doesn't just fetishize the physicality?
Right. Yeah. So what I would want to say is it's a fine line, but it is a line where I want to say that it's not just this like naively physicalistic view where it's not depending on sociality or anything like that, but it's also where it's bound up with action, not just the object itself, but it's that the object has been incorporated into your action, right? Okay. And what is the claim with the intellectual property claim? It's not, say, that I have this computer disk incorporated into my action.
So I have the contents.
Yes, I have the concept. But the concept is not something that is necessarily rivalrous. And by that I mean, like, I can use the concept to the best of my ability, and you can use the concept at the same time, and neither of our use is making the other use impossible, right? Whereas with physical objects, and this is the only reason I think property is justified, actually, is that it's impossible for us both to be using the same physical object, right? Whereas with ideas, because they don't occupy physical space, we can be using them at the same time fully without making it impossible to use it the way the other person is using it.
So actions, as it were, in the realm of ideas don't have mutually rivalrous physical manifestations.
Yeah.
That physical.
So, I mean, the thing that kind of cliche thing that people say is that intellectual property theft is as if I stole your car, but in the morning it was still there, right? Where it seems weird to say that I stole your car, right? Well, by just because I have an identical car now, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And what I'm going to say about that is, what's important about that is that your physical use of the car is in no way hindered by my physical use of these actually entirely separate things that I've used to copy the car with, right?
So
like the only thing that's being shared here is the concept of the car.
This also opens the grounds for more legitimate forms of commons ownership.
Absolutely.
Too. Okay.
Yeah. So also I want to say, we haven't talked about common. I guess we hinted at it earlier, but like, I want to say that this kind of view, I think, allows for a much more principled libertarian take on common property, which is that of course common property is allowable. It just has to be this kind of bounded use where it's necessarily a kind of common social use. the property is being made into. So Billy Christmas has a really good paper on this called Ambidextrous Lockeanism in the journal Economics and Philosophy.
Yeah.
Highly recommend.
Okay, cool. All right, so we're low on time, but I did want to get into this a little bit. What do we do if our view of the prohibition on violence, the moral presumption against the prohibition of violence, in fact, contradicts with our view of what is implied by relational egalitarianism or distributive justice concerns?
Yeah. So part of the answer to that question is a very unhelpful answer, but I think a necessary answer, which is there's not really an answer to the question of what do we do when these two things conflict, because we have to unpack what is the way in which they conflict, right? Because different ways in which they might conflict, we're going to have different answers, right? So you might say that two people, that some kind of relation between these two people is such that it's unjust in a relational egalitarian way, right?
Okay.
But it's just like an interpersonal thing, right? It's not like a society-wide
so
thing.
you've sanctioned something like absentee land ownership with the theory of violence.
So I think I do want to say that I think that like the landlord case that.
But because I view my landlord as a landlord, there's certain ways that I relate to him that are inegalitarian and necessarily hierarchical.
So I think that there's, and this is kind of similar to some of the other. So I think that there's a way of reifying the relational egalitarianism such that like anything that naively looks like a status hierarchy is a status hierarchy. I don't think that's quite right. So
okay.
I think that it's possible. So do not throw your phone or whatever you're listening to this on at the wall yet. I think it's possible to be in a wage labor relationship where the employee and the employer are on equal terms. However, the way in which that would have to be the case would have to depend somewhat on kind of background structural concerns, right? Mm-hmm. So if there was like a robust market of cooperative arrangements as well, right? And a robust...
And plenty of opportunities for exit.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main point I'm getting here. Like, opportunities for exit. Not just the right of exit. Not just like the negative right of exit. But positive opportunities.
And opportunities for complaint if the employer becomes
Yes, exactly.
abusive. This is why you have
in like...
social institutions.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there is a way in which the employee-employer relationship could be, given background conditions, just the same as a spot transaction between two people.
Yeah.
Right?
There's nothing special about labor that makes it...
Yeah. However, that's not... I'm not saying that's our world, because this is a distinction that even a lot of, like, communist anarchists have made in the past between wage labor simpliciter versus the wage system, where the wage system is the situation where virtually everyone, just as a matter of course, of a certain class, is going to have to work in a wage labor relationship.
What Carson calls the cash nexus.
They have to be part of the wage labor relationship specifically, rather than a cooperative or rather than some other kind of arrangement, right?
Right.
Where it's not a robust choice. It's not voluntary, we might say.
Yeah.
But so what I was trying to get at earlier is there's many different ways, but there's at least a couple different ways we might say that the non-aggression and the relational egalitarianism run up against one another. One is very individual and interpersonal, right? Where there's two people who are, one of them is relationally above the other, and you could fix this with violence, right? But then that would be aggressive, right?
I push my landlord off my land because he's being a jerk or something. Or
so I'm not even thinking... So the landlord... What I was trying to say is also, I think the landlord case is complicated because I think that's going to look like the employee-employer case, where that's going to be very contingent on...
Right. I see.
Anyway, so...
Okay, so
what I'm trying to say is I don't think... I think that when we're looking at, like, a potential conflicts between the relational egalitarianism and the libertarianism, you might put it, is that there's conflicts of like kind of spot conflicts,
right?
Where you could imagine this being fixed in a way that would happen to be bad on this grounds, right? There's that kind of conflict, and then there's a structural conflict, right? And so, those are going to be different. So you might say,
unpack the structural.
Yeah. So the structural would be where it's not just I can see that in this instance, right, things could be better along relational egalitarianism grounds if I engage in aggression. It's not just that. It's rather that robustly doubling down on non-aggression is going to make certain kinds of relational inequalities just like the norm, right? That there's some deep conflict where you can't live with both, right?
So the picture we have in mind, just to like tell a story to make this point plausible, is we set up this system of market transactions based off of the preferred theory of property rights that you get out of the what is violence question. And then that just happens to lead to like a distribution of wealth such that it is structurally not possible for the have-nots to relate to the haves in relationally egalitarian ways.
So, let me make this really stark in just really extreme cases. Different points of reference that different listeners will be familiar with in different ways. Say that anarchism, it is market anarchism, yay, but it's like a really like right-wing kind of anarcho-capitalism.
It leads to Hoppe and Kaplan.
In maybe even worse than Hoppe and Kaplan. You could say, no, it doesn't just... It starts off, it just normal market anarchism, then distinctively anarcho-capitalism, then distinctively Hoppe anarcho-capitalism, then like some kind of literal private government, like neo-reactionary type scenario.
Like the type of picture painted in Outer Worlds video game.
I don't know that, but that's another good point of reference, because the one I was going to give is, it's been a while since I've seen it, but what appears to be the case in Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, yeah.
Where that guy just owns that water supply, right? And seems to, as a result of just owning the one spot of water, basically, like, privately, like, lord over all these other people, right?
Yeah, right.
So that would be an extreme kind of structural thing. And I think if that's the case, then I think we have to go back to the drawing board with moral theory. Because I think that you're not going to have moral principles that are going to come apart that robustly, that systematically. And I think that's going to mean that we have to either reinterpret what we mean by non-aggression or what we mean by relational egalitarianism, or both. And
so, like Roderick, last time he brought up the...
Reciprocal determination?
Yeah, reciprocal. He put it in terms of unity of virtue. But
exactly. Yeah. In unity of virtue, reciprocal determination.
So you think that the relational is constrained by...
And I think the non-aggression is going to be constrained by it as well.
Okay.
But in that structural way, not in the independent way. That doesn't mean, for example, that there's going to be cases where someone kind of puts someone down, as it were, in the relational egalitarian way.
Your boss being a jerk.
Yeah, that's where you could imagine that being fixed in the spot instance, right? It allows for those kind of divergences, and I think, and when we're looking at those kind of divergences, I want to say that given on the assumption, right, that it doesn't have this systematic structural rupture in our moral thinking, right, that it's just these spot instances, that those are being the cases where we most need politics, not in the state sense, but in the methodological anarchist sense. Right, where there's other kinds of norm contestation. And there's no reason, I think, to fetishize violence as that's that's the best way of, not even the best way, that's the way of dealing with moral problems. Oftentimes, violence is just a very weak way sometimes, honestly, even with dealing other acts of violence, but certainly with social norms, those are the things where you're going to want to organize other kinds of social contestation that are going to challenge the spot instances. You're going to check them in other ways, like labor organizing being kind of like a constitutional check, as it were, on boss power.
And here constitutional is being used very metaphorically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's constitutional
norms.
In the sense of social norms.
Okay, so the Mad Max example brought up this question. How do you interpret the Lockean proviso? A property claim is justified when it leaves good enough and as much enough for other people. So in the Mad Max claim, if you claimed an initial property ownership of the only water spot in the desert or whatever, that would be unjustified because it's not leaving enough for others.
Right.
Is one way to read it. Nozick has the Pareto improving. Your property rights claim is justified insofar as it doesn't leave anyone else worse off, so long as it leaves you better off and no one else worse off.
Yeah.
Pareto improvement. And then some people have much more robust egalitarian restrictions in how they read the Lockean proviso, like Hillel Steiner. Where would you fall on interpreting that?
So here's what I would want to say is that, so first of all, I just want to say, I kind of gestured in this direction earlier, that I wish there was a word for the kind of libertarian picture that we talk about as Lockeanism that wasn't connected to a certain person's name.
Like Robert Nozick or Rothbard or whatever.
Yeah. Like, I'm inclined often to refer myself Rothbardian, because I think he's better than Locke on certain questions. But
this is one where he has like a minimal we should throw out the Lockean proviso.
But then my thought here is I think there's something right about the Lockean proviso, which is we don't want the sorts of problems that people are worried with the Lockean proviso to come about. But then the Lockean proviso itself, it seems kind of like a really theoretically unsatisfying way of fixing it, because it literally feels like a Band-Aid, right? Where it's like,
it feels ad hoc.
So my theory, plus, except not when the bad thing happens, right? Yeah. So you wouldn't
want to say that the Lockean proviso is interpreted along relational egalitarian lines.
So I might want to say something really similar to that, though.
Okay.
So I wouldn't want to put it... So I go back and forth about whether or not I want to say that, or whether or not I want to say I don't believe in the proviso per se, right? Or I might want to say it's not like you have the theory plus this like thing like plus a patch, right? But you might want to say, no, the libertarianism is actually grounded in the relational egalitarianism, right? Where you want to say...
So the reason we care about violence is in part determined by the caring about equal relationships.
Yeah, and this also goes back to the reciprocal determination, because you might say that it seems like that, to some degree, what does it mean to treat other people as equals? To treat them as having equal authority, right? What does it mean to treat them as having equal authority, for them to be sovereign over themselves? What does it mean for them to be sovereign over themselves? This non-aggression type stuff. And so it's kind of a constitutive element of the relational egalitarianism. But since that's the grounding element, right, it can't kind of run up in this like deep systematic structural way against... It can't run up in a deep systematic structural way against the relational egalitarianism. And if it runs up in this deep way with relational egalitarianism, that's why we go back to the drawing board, since the whole point of it was already to spell out the relational egalitarianism. And so as a result of that, you might also say that certain kinds of property norms are going to be constrained in some ways by relational egalitarianism, but it's not like a proviso. It's part of the logic of the property norm itself, if that makes sense.
So you're embedding the proviso into the property rights themselves.
It's already in the bloodstream, you might say. It's not like a pill you add.
A worry I have is that this is not what you want to say, but it begins to get close to it. You don't want to say that relational egalitarian concerns are lexically prior to property rights claims. But how are you not saying that?
So what you might say, well, the one way to put it, I think, would be so that the libertarian concerns are relational egalitarian concerns.
Right.
Right.
Concerns about initiation of violence is itself a relation.
Yes, exactly.
If people are free to initiate violence over each other, then the strongest.
Yeah. So when we're talking about apparent conflicts with relational egalitarianism and libertarianism, when we get really specific, we're not talking about conflicts between relational egalitarianism and something else. We're talking about two parts of relational egalitarianism. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
And so as a result of that, we would want to say that the apparent conflict between something that's not a libertarian in this, I mean, it is in like a thick libertarian sense, but bracketing that, so that not a thin libertarian issue, right, that seems to be in conflict with the apparent logic of like libertarian rights theory, right, that really we're saying, here's one part of the relational egalitarian concern, here's another part of the relational egalitarian concern. And then it's going to be a matter of figuring out in this context whether or not one thing or other can
that
plausibly...
Makes sense.
So and part of it is...
You're almost going for like reflective equilibrium.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like... I'm not a big fan of Rawls, but I think he got reflective equilibrium right. Although in... whatever the opposite of the word fairness is to Rawls, he really got that from Aristotle, so... Anyway.
I thought he really got it from Goodman. Anyway.
well...
I'm joking.
Okay, but real quickly, so just, I think, give a more concrete answer to your question, though. So, you might say that I have, like, a donut. Are you familiar with the donut problem?
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so for the listeners... So you say...
I just buy up all the property around you, and now
exactly.
you're trapped, surrounded by my property with no way to get out.
You got to get out with a helicopter.
Yeah.
That's the apparent, right.
Yeah.
If you have a certain kind of libertarian, a bad kind of libertarian view, it looks like you got to get out with a helicopter. I'm going to say, no, you don't got to get out with a helicopter. The fact that the property rights are only justified as a means of, like, allowing people's actions to become possible with one another means that the person has to allow you to come and go through the donut, right?
So there is
you have kind of a natural easement.
There is so there is an enforceable obligation to sign an easement. Okay.
I don't even know about sign an easement. You've already got the easement.
Okay.
It just has to be recognized. It's like a natural easement.
That's what I meant by sign.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last question I always like to ask that people seem to not like answering because it's so restricted in various ways is, what are 3 books, journal articles, movies, whatever, that you think the audience should read if they want to learn more about what has influenced your thought?
Yeah. So I'm going to break that rule. And I'm going to give you, depending on how you want to individuate this, either like 5 things or way more than 5 things. So first, I want to recommend a paper by Don Lavoie, who was an economist, but also thought a lot about kind of broader political philosophy, called Democracy, Markets, and Legal Order, in which I'm not as prone to the language of democracy, but talks about this kind of broader political interest beyond just either the market per se or states per se. That kind of gets to the methodological anarchism stuff that I was talking about in a certain respect. Then, so first that Don Lavoie article, and then I'm also going to say, relatedly, read more of the Ostroms, and I guess especially her, I want to say this was her Nobel address, Beyond Markets and States, obviously along the same lines, and then, and that's when I say the Ostroms, I intentionally say the Ostroms, so Eleanor obviously, but also Vincent Ostrom. Can be hard to read sometimes, but it's worth it. Then I'm also going to say, read more Roderick Long.
Previous guest.
Very hard to go wrong with his stuff. Very influential on me personally. And when I say read more Roderick Long, I mean read everything from him. like old blog posts, the comment threads in old blog posts, so on and so forth. Anyway, but actually, because this feeds into the last thing I'm going to say, My friend Billy Christmas, who I co-authored that Methodological Anarchism paper with, one time I saw on Twitter someone had said something like, what is the most underrated work of philosophy? And he retweeted it with Roderick Long's blog archive. And I think that might be right. And then the last thing is Billy's paper, which I mentioned earlier, Ambidextrous Lockeanism, where he talks about the way in which this kind of broader Lockean view that's focused on action can incorporate common property. And now that I think about it, one more thing that I intended to bring up, which is we talked a lot about relational egalitarianism. Mm-hmm. So to give you a general sense of that view, which is essentially that when we talk about equality, what we care about is not equalizing the amount of stuff people have, but that people relate to one another,
or just
as
that they're
equals.
Equal before the law or whatever.
Right. It's not just that, but it's also relating to one another as equals. And that would be her paper.
Sorry, her? Liz Anderson?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry. Is Elizabeth Anderson's paper, What is the Point of Equality?
Yep. All right, well, plug some stuff. Where can people find more of your work?
For right now, just, I guess, my Twitter, Jason Lee Byas with a Y. And also ASC4SS. And I should have a website at some point in the future, but not yet. But it might exist at some point.
Well, thank you, Jason, for coming on the show. It was a great discussion. Hope to have you on in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Jason again for coming on and having such an enlightening and provocative discussion for so long. As I mentioned earlier, if you like this show and want to support what we do, you can support us on Patreon. If you decide to do so, you will get special bonus content and swag as a thank you, including free books, buttons, zines, and special credit at the end of the show, as well as bonus episodes and interviews. If any of that sounds appealing to you, or if you just want to support these types of projects and conversations, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ssdotorg. And here's a special thank you to our current associate producers, Stacey Jamal, Derek W., David Colburn, Acton Rolls, Cecil Dion, Jacob Sykepin, DT, Alex Gakowski, and James Tuttle. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one.